The Cuban Revolution's end in 1959 placed Fidel Castro as the head of state for Cuba. As the head, Castro began to implement many social, economic, and political policies to improve Cuban society after Batista's regime and the war. In order to secure his authority and the ideals of the revolution, Castro began to police the state, restricting many intellectual and political rights of people to destabilize any opposition toward himself. He also began to imprison people who opposed his regime or were suspected of conspiring against Castro and the Cuban government. This included people that disagreed with Castro's political position and ideology, such as the upper-class Cuban elites, those that disapproved of the turn that the government had taken, such as other political parties and religious followers, and those whose works threatened the revolution's goals, such as artists, poets, writers, journalists, musicians, and filmmakers. Eventually, these counter-revolutionaries found themselves in political prisons.
These political prisoners had the choice to enter voluntary rehabilitation programs to essentially cure them of their anti-Castro feelings. Those who did not volunteer, however, were subject to ill treatment, which included abuse, starvation, and isolation, to force them to join. The overall condition of these prisons were especially brutal, as prisoners would face regular beatings, electric shock therapy, and be forced to work on farms and in labor camps from 10 to 12 hours a day. They also had extremely minimal access to medical treatment for injuries or diseases, and many often died as a result. Sergio Bravo, a Baptist preacher imprisoned during the Cuban Revolution, accounts the poor medical treatment he was victim to. He accounts,
"I had forgotten my Bible on the bunk. One of the guards saw me into the cell to get it and fired his gun, hitting me in the leg. I was bleeding, but they refused to take me out. In the end, although in the opinion of our doctors, there was no necessity to amputate the leg, it was amputated."
Another testimony from political prisoner and American former Black Panther Tony Bryant documents,
"I was put in a cell, originally built to hold about 80 men. We were 233 prisoners heaped together there. A hole in the floor in which to defecate was the only sanitary installation. The water was rationed to such an extent that we often spent up to 2 days in appalling thirst."
Another notable Cuban political prisoner who we briefly discussed in class is Armando Valladares. He described how he was kept in an unlighted jail cell for 9 years and would oftentimes march barefoot on sharp rocks, and he'd be asked to jump into ditches with sewages. Political prisoners like him, however, remained strong in their opposition against the regime. Valladares, for example, would write poetry on scraps with his blood and go to major extents to get them out into the world.
March 18th, 19th, and 20th marked the days 75 peaceful journalists, librarians, and activists were arrested and imprisoned.
Se me detuvo el día 19 de marzo de 2003, ¿no? Un gran operativo policíaco se generó en torno a la casa. Quienes practicaron un registro de aproximadamente 5 horas, registro minucioso, ¿no?
These 3 days were part of a government crackdown that aimed to end growing dissatisfaction stimulated by the work of independent journalists from Manuel Marquez Sterling Journalism Society and the Varela Project. This crackdown created panic among the Cuban population. This very thing happened to Espinosa Chepe, a journalist and activist, at 4 p.m. on the 19th of March. The police searched Chepe's apartment even though he kept his articles and book in a public workspace. Chepe describes the conditions of the prison he was kept in.
"At around 3 a.m., I was driven to the state security headquarters known as Villa Marista. I was locked up in a tiny walled-in cell with 3 prisoners accused of drug trafficking. There was only an iron grill hanging from the wall by metal chains, like a basket, and no mattress. Two people could not walk simultaneously in the space between the baskets. In a corner, there was a hole for our physical necessities in a water duct, but we had to call out to the guard every time we needed the water. The light was kept on 24 hours a day, and it was impossible to see outside. I was only given soap in order to clean my mouth. I had to ask for a toothbrush that was to be returned immediately after each use. The guard would shave me nastily whenever I received a visit.
Chepe was then interrogated and accused of acting under orders of the United States. They expected Chepe to admit to a crime he knew he never did.